It is 1945. Scientists who helped develop the first atomic weapons in the Manhattan Project created the Doomsday Clock. This clock is always counting down to midnight, showing how close we are to reaching a man-made global disaster, the end of all life as we know it. With the goal of raising awareness about the growing threats to our planet and to humanity as a whole. The Doomsday Clock is one of the main symbols of the most celebrated comic book in history, Watchmen. It is 1985. Tensions have never been higher between the world's biggest superpowers. The threat of nuclear war is imminent. The Doomsday Clock is at 12 minutes to midnight. And in the midst of all of this, a former superhero, the comedian, is murdered. This 12-issue series, written by Alan Moore and drawn by Dave Gibbons, tells a story using superheroes to talk about the fears and anxieties of the world in the 1980s. Watchmen tries to imagine what would really be the impact of costume vigilantes in our society, showing the psychological effects this life would have on people who choose to don a mask to try and save the world. After Watchmen, the comic book industry was never the same. This series, along with The Dark Knight Returns, were the first comics to have its issues collected in trade paperbacks, being marketed as graphic novels to be sold in bookstores, making comics more accessible to a broader audience. Watchmen is DC Comics' biggest critical and commercial success, and it is the only graphic novel that got into the 2005 Times Magazine list of the top 100 all-time novels. But unfortunately, most of the comic book industry took the wrong lessons from the series, crediting its success to a dark tone, violent story, and more serious approach to the superhero genre, something that still influences comic books and superheroes to this day. For decades, Watchmen has been hailed as an untouchable masterpiece. No one dared to pick up the story from where it left off. But in 2017, the first issue of Watchmen sequel was released, a sequel from a completely new creative team. Jeff Johns and Gary Frank had a story that they felt was very important to tell in this day and age. A story where the Watchmen characters end up in the DC universe, home of superheroes like Batman and Superman. It is 2017. The world is on the brink of collapse thanks to the increasing popularity of the Superman theory, a conspiracy theory that questions the origins of superpowered individuals in the United States, reframing them as living weapons of mass destruction, hiding in plain sight, playing a theater of good guys versus bad guys. An arms race for superheroes is ignited around the world. Distrust among the world's nations and institutions is ever growing, and society has never been so divided. The Doomsday Clock is ticking for the DC universe. It is 12 minutes to midnight. What can the most iconic superheroes do in face of this ever-growing tension? How can they save their world? Like Watchmen, Doomsday Clock imagines the effects of superheroes in our modern society, putting the ultimate challenge in front of them: the threat of global annihilation, not by some powerful evil entity, but by humanity itself. Borrowing all of Watchmen's storytelling devices to tell a story about the crises and fears of the world today, shedding light on the importance of the idea of the superhero. In this video, we're going to understand why Watchmen is such a masterpiece, by exploring some of the groundbreaking ways it uses the comic book medium, and what the writer Alan Moore wanted the readers and future creators to take away from his work. To find out why Doomsday Clock is exactly the follow-up that Alan Moore always wanted to see. When creating Watchmen, Moore and Gibbons wanted to explore all the possibilities of the comic book medium, a medium that uses both words and pictures to tell a story. The different ways these two elements can interact are virtually unlimited. And that is what makes comics such a unique and powerful tool to tell stories. So to get the best out of these two elements, artist Dave Gibbons wanted to structure Watchmen's pages in a 9-panel grid. Doing so would give the writer Alan Moore a lot of control about the rhythm of the story and the density of information on each page. The 9-panel grid also makes the artist exercise his creativity with compositions, always ending up with very clean and easy to understand pages. Let's take a look at how Watchmen uses words, pictures, and the 9-panel grid to tell a story. In this page, we are following a conversation between Laurie and Dan, where she talks about her relationship with John, who is getting ready for an interview. So we are hopping back and forth between two different places, Dan's apartment and John's apartment. The text is moving the story forward. Dan, living with him, you don't know what it's like. And at the same time, it gives us context to what we are seeing when we change locations. The way he looks at things, like he can't remember what they are and doesn't particularly care. But what is really interesting is how what is being said and what is being shown can interact in different ways, like creating an echo, just shadows in the fog, or a sense of irony, somewhere normal. Sometimes the text can start a page transition, very literally like this. Here's looking at you, kid. Yeah, here's looking at me. Or in a more subtle way. Laurie says she's in a bad mood, cutting to a panel with a TV producer being angry that John is late. This next page shows the flexibility of the 9-panel grid. It is very easy to give space to some scenes that need more details. I feel sick. They're not paying me enough for this. They're not paying me enough to handle monsters from outer space. Or to make some scenes tighter. But play cool and try not to get into any tight corners. Contrasting the next moment on a larger panel that creates a sense of looming threat, with the text helping to set a tone and begin a transition. That's certainly dark enough for my purposes. So words and pictures can interact within a panel in between two different scenes, but they can also have these same interactions between two different stories. Occasionally, Watchmen focuses on a kid reading a comic book, The Tales of the Black Freighter. The words and pictures from this comic bleed into the main story, and like before, their interactions are used to create a connection between the two stories. And I knew that life had no worse news to offer me. Her damp embrace had prevented me from drifting beyond reach, yet the small comfort was all I could offer. I could not love her as she loved me. Both are basically telling the same story, and this is used to reinforce the ideas and themes of Watchmen. At one instance, Alan Moore even uses the kid who reads the comic to tell the reader to pay attention, and read the book again to get all of these details. They don't make sense, man. That's why I gotta read them over. Watchmen does not let any aspect of the comic book medium go to waste. It is full of different interactions and layers of meaning. Every single word that is written and every single thing that is drawn is there for a reason. Watchmen asks us to get involved and to think about every single panel, always rewarding us for our attention. This makes reading Watchmen a very unique and fun experience. It makes you want to read it again, because every time you read the story, you can uncover something new about it that you've never noticed before. But none of these storytelling devices would mean anything if they were not being used to tell a good story. Writing Watchmen, Alan Moore wanted to talk about the crisis and issues of the world during the 1980s, especially the looming threat of nuclear war. Fear being the strongest theme throughout the story. The society that just thinks that they can do whatever they want because they're invulnerable, they're not afraid. And they can gloss over the terror of the nuclear stockpiles, the world situation and all, and just think, hey, we're doing alright, we're okay. I was consciously trying to do something that would make people feel uneasy. At the risk of doing a depressing comic book, we thought that it would be nice to try and scare a little bit, so that people would just stop and think about their country and their politics. The superheroes in Watchmen are full of fear, and Alan Moore's goal was to treat them realistically by picking at their flaws. Superheroes wouldn't be able to just magically save the world, for they would also be just as damaged, scared, traumatized, and fallible as anyone else. So Moore tried his best to make people read carefully and really think about the comic, by using a very layered and unique approach to tell the story, peppering through the book the quote, "Who watches the Watchmen?" In a way, trying to make people question authority, to not simply accept things as they are, and to not leave our fates at the hands of others. But although Watchmen is about superheroes, and deals with some very strong themes and ideas, for Alan Moore, it was all about the form. About the ways we can use the comic book medium to tell stories unlike anywhere else. For Scott McCloud in his book, Understanding Comics, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons became explorers, trying to uncover all that comic books are capable of. Creators who take this path are often pioneers and revolutionaries, artists who want to shake things up, change the way people think, question the fundamental laws that govern their chosen art.
I've never actually much looked at superheroes. My early work in them, it's largely about trying to destroy them. Things like Marvel Man, Watchmen, these are not really they weren't meant to be things that revitalised the superhero. Quite the opposite. You know, I was thinking, well, if I expose all of the flaws in the concept in an interesting way, then people will have to revise the idea. But no, that wasn't how it worked out. And we got, instead, a lot of people doing really grim stories. I got quite distressed that after Watchmen, nobody had taken up the challenge of, I'd seen Watchmen, I thought, this is an important comic because of the storytelling devices that we've come up with. That is the only thing that's important about it. It's not that it's a darker view of superheroes. I'd already done Marvel Man by that point. That wasn't the main point. It was just how to tell the story in a way that no one's done it before. But the things that the rest of the creative community seemed to take from Watchmen, they didn't take any of the admittedly difficult storytelling stuff. They largely thought, oh right, we can be more violent, we can be more miserable, we can be more pretentious, we can have more sex.
But sadly, the comic book industry learned the wrong lessons from Watchmen, and no one took Alan Moore's challenge to revise the idea of the superhero and tell a story exploring the comic book medium like he and Dave Gibbons did. That is until Doomsday Clock. Jeff Johns wanted to write a story with the Watchmen characters in the DC universe for a long time, but he would only do it if his frequent collaborator, Gary Frank, was the one to draw it. But after having many conversations, they both agreed that the story was still missing something. They knew that following Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons would be the biggest challenge of their lives, so they decided to only move forward when the story became something that the duo really believed in. But more importantly, Johns and Frank wanted to have a very strong reason to tell the story. And this only came to be after the US 2016 presidential election.
In 2016, that in November, the election happened in the US, and then a lot of other things happened in the world. And I was looking at everything, and I reread Watchmen, and suddenly one day the story just It was in my head. And I called Gary Frank and I said, okay, Gary, I think I have the story. And he was like, okay, let me hear it. And I pitched it to him and he said, I have to draw that story.
That's when the story became something that they both felt they needed to tell, and that this was the time to do it. Watchmen didn't happen in the year of fake news. That was not a thing. Even a few years ago, the idea of and the level of misinformation, and how easy it would be to sell misinformation, it would have been hard to believe. And yet, here we are. Watchmen was a product of its time, and I think Doomsday Clock needs to be that as well if it's going to work. Going back to Scott McCloud's book, Jeff Johns and Gary Frank decided to use the comic book medium as a tool, telling their story being more important than the exploration of the medium. This is the path of great storytellers, creators who have something to say through comics, and devote all their energies to controlling their medium, refining its abilities to convey messages effectively. And to do so, Doomsday Clock uses the same storytelling devices developed by the original creative team. The writer Jeff Johns called them the Watchmen's Rulebook.
I like the idea of a Watchmen rulebook. What are some of the rules in the Watchmen rulebook?
You know, it's a very different book when you're like, okay, now I'm gonna use some of these characters and write a story. You read the book differently as a writer and as an artist. You know, when you open the book, I wanted people to go, that has an echo and reminds me of Watchmen, visually, just visually. So the storytelling is based on a 9-panel grid. It varies, but it has to be based on that 9-panel grid. And the pacing of it is very particular. It's a very character-driven book. There's moments in it that are just about character. It's not about plot, and that was important. And then the dialogue and how it works or doesn't work with the art is really important. And the thematics and the subtext. So all of that is in the rule book.
You must be working sort of both on the level of sort of foreground and background at the same time, just pushing stuff into the background so that it'll play off the foreground.
Yeah, it's the foreground, it's the background, and some things in the background then can become the foreground, you know, and inform everything else. There's some stuff particularly there's something in issue 2 that we're going to be playing around with that'll kind of thread through the whole series. That's a bit of a background thing that becomes a foreground thing.
Johns and Frank use Watchmen's Rulebook to talk about the issues that the world is facing today, telling a story about the dangers of misinformation. Superman theory is supposed to be something that is creating this world tension, reflecting some of how misinformation can actually get very, very dangerous in our world, and in this case, even more so. A story about the ever-growing us versus them mentality that exists these days. Seeing something you can't see, or seeing beyond your blind spots, and seeing another side, another way. That's really what the book's about. This idea is expressed in a phrase that constantly shows up throughout the story. See what you want to see. Many of the conflicts and challenges that the characters in the story are facing boil down to one thing. They cannot see past their own ways of thinking and assumptions, and that is what's destroying them and the world. So to try and give us an answer to how can we break away from our own domes of biases and preconceived notions, Jones tries to revise the idea of the superhero as our olive branch, using the most iconic superhero, Superman, to give us a way out. Superman does not exist to save us, because he cannot save us from ourselves. Superman exists to inspire us, to give us hope that we can be better, that there's always another way, that nothing is as hopeless as it seems. In the story, Superman knows that he cannot save the world alone. The only thing he can do is the same thing that all of us can, to try and understand, connect with, and help another person, and hope that this person will do the same for someone else. If we try to understand each other and work together, there is nothing that we cannot do. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were revolutionaries that wanted to explore their medium, using all of the possibilities of comics to tell a story that incentivizes the reader to pay attention. and to really think about the ideas that the author thought were important for the world at that time, while also picking at the flaws of superheroes in an interesting way. And what Alan Moore wanted to see after Watchmen was other creators taking the challenge of making comics using Watchmen's intricate storytelling devices, in trying to revise the idea of the superhero. Exactly what Jeff Johns and Gary Frank did. They wanted to challenge themselves to tell a story that they believed in and considered important for the world today, using Watchmen's storytelling devices to create a lasting impact on the readers, and at the same time, revising the idea of the superhero as something that can give us hope, a symbol that can inspire us to see and create a better future. Hello! Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. One thing that I really wanted to talk about in the video, but unfortunately couldn't find the space to put it, was about the morality of making a Watchmen sequel. Because back in the day, DC Comics kinda stole Watchmen's rights from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. I'll be leaving in the description some articles going all over the story, as well as everything else that I covered in the video, so you can go check these out if you're interested. Also, if you really liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, because next month's video we're gonna take a look at 3 very different movies, and we're gonna learn what they can teach us about how to make a good sequel. See you next month.